Welcome to another University of Canberra Week in Politics. My name's Mark Evans and I'm Director of the ANZSOG Institute for Governance here at the University of Canberra. I'm standing in once again for Professor Stephen Parker, our Vice-Chancellor, who is travelling dealing with difficult international issues at the moment himself. Well, Michelle, it's been another very busy week in Australian politics, both domestically and internationally. Let's begin with the key international story. The Papua New Guinea issue is attracting some heated exchanges and long column issues, both at home and overseas. It's been described variously as outsourcing asylum, a colonial insult, an affront to human rights. So how do you think the Papua New Guinea issue is playing with both Kevin Rudd and Tony Abbott?
My impression is that Labor is fairly happy with the general impact of this very drastic way of trying to deal with the asylum seekers and stop the boat arrivals. Basically, they think that they've sent out a tough message and they're not too worried, it appears, at the reaction which says this is not a humanitarian solution, that it really is traducing the rights of people, that they're just focused on trying to get that hard message out. From Tony Abbott's point of view, it's been quite difficult. His reaction has been somewhat mixed, welcoming the toughness of the policy at one level, but also finding fault with it. And then, of course, Papua New Guinea's Prime Minister Peter O'Neill said that Tony Abbott had misrepresented his position. There's been this whole argument about the aid package and how much control Papua New Guinea will have compared to Australia about how that money's been spent. So basically, the bottom line is, I think the issue has worked reasonably for the government, and now the government's hoping to move on to other things.
Do you think the issue would be playing out differently if there wasn't an election around the corner? Because, of course, the international perspective on this, given the problem in terms of the International Convention on Human and Political Rights for PNG, does look alarming from an international perspective.
Well, I think the policy is quite alarming from a number of perspectives, and absolutely you're right. It would be looked at quite differently if we weren't on the brink of an election, because it's hard to see, unless this has a quick deterrent effect, how this would be sustainable. There would be huge numbers for Papua New Guinea to deal with. There'd be great problems settling these people in that country, which is supposed to happen, and there could be a lot of criticism of the government there from its own people and a lot of tension in the community. So this is certainly, unless it works spectacularly, it is a band-aid which is going to come off quite quickly and expose the sore.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a problematic policy from both a moral and an efficiency perspective.
Exactly.
Let's turn our attention now to the key domestic issues. Well, first of all, what is the latest on the timing of the election? And what are the implications of the strategizing behind the timing of the date?
Well, the latest is it won't be announced in the next few days. Kevin Rudd said he's got more to do, and that is true. In particular, he's got an economic statement to get out. So no announcement this weekend or Monday. I tend to think beyond that, it's a week-by-week proposition. Of course, the bigger issue is whether he goes in September or whether he goes really late. I think still the feeling is to go earlier rather than later, but we are dealing with Kevin Rudd. He's not necessarily the most predictable character, and so I think we have to have this discussion every week.
And I suppose, it's interesting to see this from Tony Abbott's perspective, because obviously his track record in dealing head-to-head with Kevin Rudd hasn't been too great. So I suppose he's actually probably hoping that it's a little bit earlier himself as well.
Well, it's very difficult for the opposition. For ages, of course, it had the September 14 date. It could do its planning around that. It could book in advertising time, which it did. Now all those things have to be pulled, as they have been on both sides. And Tony Abbott is not anxious to engage with Kevin Rudd ahead of time, ahead of the campaign, hence he's refused to be part of the debates. Kevin Rudd, on the other hand, is very anxious to get Tony Abbott engaged in a sort of toe-to-toe contest, but he won't be able to do that until he actually calls the election.
I mean, the Kevin Rudd story itself is turning into a remarkable chapter in Australian political history, isn't it? We've seen the rise, the fall, and the rise again.
But how high?
Yes, exactly. Now looking at the latest opinion polls, those polls don't look so good for Kevin Rudd. So do you think maybe Rudd's peaked now, or do you think there's something more to come?
It's very hard to know, and talking to the Labor strategists, I don't think they know. I think there's probably different opinions. Everyone always is waiting for more polls these days. That's the nature of politics. But it's possible he's peaked. On the other hand, especially when the campaign is formally called, it does turn into another fight, a day by day, who won the day, who won the week. Kevin Rudd is a very good campaigner. Now, whether Tony Abbott can match that campaign or whether he loses some ground in those campaign weeks is an unknown factor at this point. Also, it's a seat-by-seat proposition, of course, because you have so many seats in which the picture is different, and these days local campaigning is really important.
So I guess this latest gambit of releasing an economic statement must have an electoral logic to it, in the sense that we know that normally the key determinant of electoral outcomes is the ability of the incumbent government to manage the economy effectively. So is the economic statement, in a sense, the last roll of the dice for this government in relation to the next election?
The statement is an absolute economic necessity for a couple of reasons. One is that, of course, we've had this expensive new boat arrival policy, and that's got to be costed, and there've got to be offsets for that. But also the budget has once again collapsed on the revenue side, which is quite strange and remarkable, I must say, because you would think that Treasury in May would have been able to get figures that at least got us through to this point. But what we now know is that the revenue figures are much worse than in the budget. Right. And of course, we also have a formal statement from Treasury and Finance 10 days into the campaign that has no political fingers on it at all. So that's the definitive economic statement. The government needs to get out the bad news before that. It can't afford to be into the campaign and suddenly there's all this talk about the budget falling apart. So that's the economic side. The political side is that economic management is the key issue. The strategists say, well, boats might be important, carbon might be important. What the people really are preoccupied with is who can manage the economy. There was an Essential research poll out this week that had it top of the pops when people were asked what influence you in the election, what issues influence you, and the Liberals were well ahead as the best managers. Kevin Rudd has to address that, has to try to neutralise the debt and deficit issue, and also has to revisit his own record in government before, convince people that he managed the global financial crisis's local implications well, and try to remove the feeling that somehow the stimulus spending was all wasted, pink bats and the rest. Yeah. So that economic statement has both an economic imperative and a political imperative.
So the irony sitting here in Canberra is that obviously the Canberra economy is likely to be hit first with the impact of that statement. I imagine the hollowing out of the Canberra bureaucracy will go ahead quite quickly now. Well,
we have both sides really saying that some bureaucrats are going to have to go. They talk about attrition, but no, the future is not quite so rosy for Canberra in terms of each side looking to Canberra for the cuts, for some cuts.
But looking at this historically, it will be interesting to see whether it does turn out that the economy is the key determinant, because clearly in recent times Australia's been bucking the trend elsewhere, that despite relative affluence, there's been a declining support for the government in power.
Well, that's the irony, isn't it? Because there was a good message to sell, and yet the government wasn't able to sell it. And Wayne Swan, of course, has been blamed in part for that. He wasn't a very good political salesman. Chris Bowen, who's now in his place, is much better at getting a message across, and certainly I think will be able to do a better job at a debating level. But the point is that when perceptions become entrenched, they're hard to change. The question is whether a change of leader, a new face at the top in whom people have confidence, is enough to make them rethink their perceptions of Labor as an economic manager.
And perceptions are everything in politics.
Almost.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Well, that's it for this week from the University of Canberra's A Week in Politics. Next week, the Vice-Chancellor, Stephen Parker, will be back in the chair.